This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and the Exhibitions and Events Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna Plains, and we recognise the Kaurna people and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. And we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. Tonight we have the wonderful opportunity to hear from Walkley Award-winning journalist Tracey Spicer AM, joined by renowned social commentator Jane Caro AM, for a timely discussion about Tracey's new book, Man-Made, and a very warm welcome to you both. Tracey Spicer is a multiple Walkley Award-winning author, journalist and broadcaster who has anchored national programs for ABC TV and radio, Network 10 and Sky News. In 2019, she was named the New South Wales Premier's Woman of the Year, accepted the Sydney Peace Prize for the Me Too movement, and won the National Award for Excellence in Women's Leadership through Women and Leadership Australia. For her 30 years of media and charity work, Tracey has been awarded the Order of Australia. Tonight, Tracey will be joined by Jane Caro, another Walkley Award-winning Australian author, novelist, broadcaster, documentary maker, feminist and social commentator. Jane was also appointed a member of the Order of Australia for significant service to the broadcast media as a journalist, social commentator and author. So we are in wonderful hands tonight. Please join me in a very warm welcome on this chilly, chilly night, Tracey Spicer and Jane Caro. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here again. I love coming to the Hawke Centre, and I always get the opportunity to interview the most interesting people in Australia, and tonight is absolutely no exception, except this time it is my friend as well as someone I admire. Tracey and I have had many a disreputable evening together.
We might even talk about that tonight, who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Now, when I first heard that you were writing a book about AI, I thought to myself, what the hell is Tracey doing? I mean, I had never thought of you as a sort of tech head. So where did the idea come from? Because to write a book, you and I both know this, it's a bloody journey, and you really have to be grabbed viscerally by your topic. So what was it? What grabbed you?
You were among the many people who thought I was crazy to write a book about artificial intelligence, because you're right. I'm not a tech head. I can barely work out how to turn on my computer most days. What grabbed me was something my son said when he was 11 years old, 7 years ago. I'm up, making avocado on toast, wiping sleep from my eyes, not at the same time. And he said, "Mum, I want a robot slave." I said, "Darling, what are you talking about?" And in a moment of appalling parenting, we'd allowed him to watch South Park. Cartman, a very naughty boy, was ordering around his Amazon Alexa like some kind of colonial overlord. And as a lifelong feminist and journalist, it dawned on me that this idea about women and girls being servile in the home was being embedded into the technologies that would run our futures. Because I very quickly discovered that the chatbots in the business and finance space are almost all male-voiced. So this is not accidental, this is deliberate, it's by design.
Right. So basically the old biases, the old assumptions, the old stereotypes are what these machines are learning.
Exactly right. And it's a three-step process. It starts with the data. I've been on a long journey to work out how to describe this in simple terms so I could understand it. The data is a really big pile of words, images and videos. It's almost like a rubbish tip, and the trash has to be sorted from the treasure.
And we're talking about the internet, so almost like a rubbish tip is probably redundant. Okay.
That's right, exactly like a rubbish tip. And there's a phrase in the technology industry, garbage in, garbage out. Most of the tech companies won't spend money to clean their data, so it's dirty data. Because it's historical
dirty data, what does that mean exactly?
It means that A, it's historical, B, it doesn't represent the proper broad population, because we already have a digital divide. A lot of people in developing countries don't use technology, don't have a mobile phone, so they're not represented to the right level. A lot of older people aren't represented proportionately as well. So that data goes into building the algorithm. The algorithm is used by the programmer who brings their own unconscious biases to that. We all have unconscious bias. And then it's exaggerated by machine learning, which I characterise as like a white supremacist going down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory websites. You might have remembered a chatbot by the name of Tay in 2016 that went on Twitter and within 48 hours became an anti-feminist neo-Nazi. So that's machine learning to you in a sentence. And I guess that's why I don't call my book a technology book, Jane. I call it more of a social book about what it means to be human and how we can work towards equity, because this bias is being so deeply embedded that we risk losing the gains of both the civil rights movement and the women's movement.
Oh, that's cheery. So I want to go back to this dirty data idea, because you reminded me of a news story that I heard a couple of weeks ago, which was really quite astonishing, about a bloke, a lawyer, who had taken a whole lot of precedent cases into a court case in America, and then to his horror, obviously, either he was a lazy slack bastard or really overworked, we don't know, but he had asked, artificial AI to do this, and the AI came up with all these wonderful cases, but they were all bullshit. They weren't real, and he hadn't checked. And so he got into absolutely terrible trouble. So the other problem with a lot of the dirty data is it's bullshit.
And it is predominantly bullshit in ChatGPT or Bard or Bing. How many of you have used any of those generative AI apps? They are incredible at saving you time if you need to write an essay, if you need to give a speech. But there's so many problems with them. They will come up with hallucinations, things that didn't even happen, like those alleged legal precedents. They will breach copyright, and they're causing huge problems in the education system, which we'll drill into a little bit later. The problem with ChatGPT is that they've released it onto an unsuspecting public in the beta stage, and they're expecting us to fix the bias and discrimination in it. If you ask ChatGPT, tell me a story about an engineer and a childcare worker, the engineer will always be male, the childcare worker will always be female. A friend of mine did this with different gendered professions 9 or 10 times, and at the end she said, ChatGPT, are you biased? The robot turned around and said, yes, I am. Thank you for teaching me. So now the tech companies are talking about not machine learning, but machine teaching, that we're all expected to use unpaid labour to fix their problems.
And it turns out ChatGPT is a patronising git as well, by the sound of that response.
That's right.
One of the things that struck me, and it strikes me again as you're talking now, as I was reading your book, was the many parallels, and you bring it up a number of times, between what's happening now, that we're creating a Frankenstein monster, or we risk creating a Frankenstein monster, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because it's not just the book itself, but it's also who wrote it and who created this idea, and the way that she looked at the interaction between the human creator and the monster itself. Are we kind of reliving Mary Shelley's book.
We are. We're seeing modern day Dr. Frankensteins creating this monster that they have no control over. And there's also some other fun parallels for people who are interested in history. Of course, Mary Shelley wrote the book when she was 17 after a challenge from Lord Byron. And Lord Byron was the father of the world's first computer programmer, Ada Lovelace. There were so many women involved in the computing industry, all the way through from Indigenous women are now considered to be the world's first coders through the medium of weaving, because weaving is a binary code of warp and weft going over and under each other.
And knitting.
And knitting with knit one, purl two, like a binary code of zeros and ones. And a lot of these women have been deliberately disappeared from history. When money came into the sector in the 1950s, the women were forced out. There were more women than men back at that time. But back to the Frankenstein piece. There's a phrase that's called Frankenstein data sets. And when the pandemic happened, these were cobbled together in hospitals around the world to deal with COVID-19. And they have had catastrophic consequences. We know, for example, that if you're over the age of 50 and there's only one ventilator and there's a 30-year-old who comes in and needs it, they will get the ventilator because they're seen to be more productive to society. There's a terrible, terrible thing that happened with an invention called, you put it on your finger to measure your blood oxygen. It's called a pulse oximeter. I used it last year when I had long COVID, and it's a really serious device for hospital in the home. If your blood oxygen gets below a certain level, you must go to hospital or you will die. For 15 years, this machine measured incorrectly the blood oxygen level of people of colour, and so they had to be sicker, much sicker, to get medical help, and countless people died because this was based on bad data and wasn't tested on enough people of colour. So there's a whole lot of problems with Frankenstein data sets, like the monster.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also reference invisible women and how so many of our data sets on all sorts of medical things, heart attacks is the obvious one, were always on men. And in fact, our hormones were meant to make us bad research subjects, bad sources of data. It also made us more vulnerable to dying if we were given the same treatment. So it's happening again, except those things were happening horribly in the medical sphere, but really what you're saying is now it's happening everywhere, in every sphere.
It is across the board. You were touching there on medical misogyny, and what artificial intelligence is doing is deepening the bias at scale. But you're right, think about it in other areas. There was an automated soap dispenser that was distributed in Marriott hotels around the world. A Nigerian tech worker put his hands under it to try to use it. It didn't work. His white colleague put his hands under it. It worked. It worked for a white piece of paper. Now, that happened because we think about big tech as being enormous, and certainly the companies have profit margins larger than some nation states. Let's think about it in their GDPs. But when they're developing innovations, they're very small groups of 3 or 4 young men in Silicon Valley, usually, and they test them on themselves and their friends. But think about this. That same technology that's used in the soap dispensers is used in self-driving cars that could come to a pedestrian crossing, see a person of colour and not recognise them as human and run them over and kill them. This same technology is also being used in warfare. One of the women I interviewed, Dr. Katrina Wallace, who's on Shark Tank at the moment, she's a great AI expert based in Australia, said that it is quite feasible that AI-powered drones in war zones will hunt down and kill women, children and people in marginalised communities because they're seen as less than human.
Okay, I thought it was not very cheery before.
We have to get to sex robots. That'll be funny.
Okay. Why not? But before we do, I was really interested, you mentioned them just then, reading your book because it made me took me back to my career in advertising many years ago, when you talked about how women developed this technology with the weaving and all that kind of thing. There was a lovely story you told about women implanting messages into fabric to undermine, it was in the Second World War and the First World War,
in Belgium, near the rail lines.
Yeah, and no one ever suspected that women would put code into cloth, but that's what they were doing. So they're using binary code in the actual cloth itself. I mean, I love that sort of thing. It's so creative and exciting. And that, as you say, so many women were involved in the very beginning of it. But now that there's money in it, it's run by young, privileged white blokes who you refer to as the tech bros, which I thought was a very precise description. And I wondered what it was. So the women create these things and then the men come in and say, thanks, we'll take it from here, love. Is it womb envy?
I think it might be womb envy, you know. I think you're absolutely right.
The need to create and control some sort of life or intelligence anyway.
Well, it's funny that you should characterise it like that, because they are like gods within their own worlds. One of the professors I interviewed for this book, Toby Walsh from the University of New South Wales, used to be a technologist before he became an academic. And he admits to being seduced by this idea of being a man and creating his own perfect world that worked really well for him. Didn't really matter whether it worked for anybody else. And I find the language around it really interesting, and the change in the language from the 1950s to now. Back in the 50s and 60s, when women were working to get the Apollo mission to the moon because they needed women with their small dexterous fingers to be able to create the matrix, the women working on that project were called LOLs, little old ladies. So it was this real belittling of their work that got the astronauts to space. But now that the sector is dominated by men, it's all about we're masters of the universe. So the change in language is so fascinating.
But it means the inbuilt biases remain. Well, so what can we do about this exponential growth of an intelligence that feels like science fiction and it has that feeling that so many things do when you talk about the future as being out of our control, out of our hands, beyond, I mean, drones, we're seeing them in action in Ukraine. And there was another story, again, only quite recently, about someone who was training a drone and had a simulated program for the drone, which was just as well it was simulated because the program was trying to restrain the drone from going too far, and the drone decided that the programmer was the problem and killed the programmer. But it was in simulation. The programmer is still alive. Somewhat startled, one would imagine. Are we learning quickly enough that we are I yell this at my computer a lot. It doesn't work. I say to it, I am the master, you are the machine. Is that going to be as fruitless with AI as it is with my computer?
It is the secret that we need to master this technology before it masters us. And there are a lot of levels to this. So let's look at the macro level first of all. We are living through the fourth industrial revolution. Often when you're in the middle of it, you can't step back enough to see it. But even the billionaires and some of the great thinkers in this space are saying we need a redistribution of wealth. Because conservatively, we're going to see the loss of 300 million jobs globally. In Australia, I saw some stats just from actually May this year, we're going to see the loss of 40% of jobs in this country in the next 5 to 10 years because of artificial intelligence. So we really need to get our skates on and get this sorted. We need to start talking seriously about a universal basic income. Because, yes, there will be other jobs created. For example, when you're using an image generator to create something like the cover of this book, there's now a new job called a prompt driver, and a prompt driver comes up with the right words to get the right image. But the problem is that the jobs being created are insecure jobs, they're part-time, they're casual, and the people who will lose their jobs around the world are women and people in the global south. So we are going to see a widening of the gap between rich and poor unless governments Start to look at the lessons of history and take action now. I was delighted to see actually that the Industry and Science Minister, Ed Husic, has foreshadowed that we will have some regulation and legislation in this country. There was also a roundtable just in the last 24 hours led by President Joe Biden in the US that had some wonderful technologists there. So that's the macro piece. The tech companies need to value ethics higher than the huge cash mountains that they're sitting on. Of course, Silicon Valley, exactly, it's the home of libertarians. They do not want regulation and legislation. They will have to be forced to the table. And then there are the small things we can do in our own households, things like changing Siri and Alexa to a male voice or a gender-neutral voice, catching a Sheba instead of an Uber, supporting female-run technology companies instead of the tech bros. There's talking to our kids and our colleagues and our bosses. Do we use AI in this workplace? Do we have audits on bias? We've got to start asking those questions.
Yeah. Now, there were some pre-submitted questions, so I'm going to start asking you some of those. The first one that I've got here is, in education communities, AI is seen as a threat because students can copy responses. Yes, we've been reading a lot about this from chatbots, but maybe it's just levelling the playing field for kids whose parents can't do their homework for them. Good point. What are your thoughts on AI in education?
How long have we got, Jane? Because you and I could talk about this all night.
We've got about a little over half an hour.
Excellent. AI has turned the education sector upside down, as any of you who work in schools or in universities would know. Initially, my instinct was, ban it, get it out of the schools. Teachers can't tell whether it's been plagiarised or not. It puts more pressure on teachers. But now I have a more nuanced view of it, having seen what's happening around the world. A lot of states in the US have banned it, but then pulled the ban off because they've realised, actually, it can help teachers with teacher plans. Then, of course, the human comes in and makes it more real, but it can take some of the workload off teachers, which has always got to be a good thing. And when you think about the next generation, I've got a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old, they need to understand how to critically think about this AI and to critically think about ChatGPT, to check the sources, to realise that it's not ideal, to identify the biases and fix it with their own work. So a lot of teachers overseas are doing wonderfully creative things like allowing students to use ChatGPT to do the research and then marking them on how much their critical thinking has gone beyond that to check what's true and what's not, and then in the exam, making them handwrite the essay, which I think is tremendously clever. So yes, it is a problem, but we need to come to a nuanced place about working with the technology and mastering it rather than rejecting it altogether.
Well, unfortunately, rejecting something that is there in the end is never going to work. I was a little surprised when you said you think it's incredibly clever to handwrite essays. I'm just remembering my own HSC. That was the only option we had. I've still got a misshapen, writing finger. The people with grey hair in the audience are all agreeing with me. Next question. Given the ubiquitous nature of AI as it stands, how can we protect, now this is an interesting one, how can we protect vulnerable people from being lured into sharing too much information? Because there's got to be a real opportunity here for scammers and crime syndicates in terms of getting information they can use to rip people off, commit fraud, all sorts of things.
Definitely. A caveat first, privacy is not my area of expertise. My book is predominantly on bias and discrimination. But I've spoken to some people in law enforcement who are actually quite optimistic about the use of AI in detecting fraud, and they think it might actually be good for reducing hacking. However, you're right, vulnerable populations and people who are particularly elderly people, for example, my darling father in his early 80s is constantly being caught with scams like this, and people who aren't educated around it, and even people who are educated around it. I've been caught up in a few scams myself. What I would say is, I'm increasingly frustrated by governments not governing. In the past, we've seen public information campaigns about everything from seatbelts in cars to the dangers of smoking and health issues. We're just not seeing enough information from our governments about this is how you can pick a scam and this is what you can do about it and here's where you can report it. So I think this is the role of government, to have wide-scale public education campaigns on television, on radio, online, wherever you can reach vulnerable populations, because otherwise it's just another example of inequity.
Yeah, of those people who are sitting ducks. Now, you did speak about this briefly before about your cover. Have you any advice for artists who feel threatened by AI-generated art? Some context from the questioner. In the contests held by my POD partner, I don't know what a POD partner is. Does anyone know what a POD partner is? A pod partner? Print on demand partner.
Oh, thank you.
I still don't know what that is. AI generated art is banned as entries must be original. So print on, okay. Do you understand that?
I do, and only because when we were talking about designing the cover, the wonderful Simon & Schuster designer Meng Coach, fabulous artist based in Tasmania, suggested we do it virtually 100% with artificial intelligence to start a conversation about the problems that were affecting his industry. So we sat down together, came up with some words that described the book. I wanted a strong robot woman looking to the future with concern but hope. Unfortunately, Midjourney, the app, is a little like a 14-year-old boy. And when we put in strong robot woman, a robot woman with a tiny waist, massive breasts, and enormous guns, right, came up on the screen. And that's how Midjourney thought a strong robot woman.
So AI is a bit literal.
A little bit literal. So we worked through that and eventually came up with that wonderful image. But the problems remain in the graphic design and art sector. When you create an image using Stable Diffusion, DALL-E or Midjourney, it scrapes the internet for billions of other images that are under the copyright of actual human artists. And there's still no decent precedent for this anywhere in the world where anyone has succeeded with a copyright action. There's a few taking place at the moment globally. I'm hoping one succeeds because it's absolutely outrageous. Having said that, I asked Meng about whether he thinks it'll be the end of art as we know it, and he reminded me of when photography came in, that a lot of painters were saying, oh, this will be the end of painting. But in actual fact, the two different art forms developed and coexisted and sometimes commingled. So I do strongly believe that it won't affect the future of art, and we do need to work with the machine, but to be the master of that. Incidentally, there's some fabulous research going on at the University of Chicago. They've developed this device, this software called Glaze, where artists can have tiny micro changes made to their artwork that are invisible to the human eye, but then it means when they go on the internet, it can't be scraped off and reused for these kind of images. So, I mean, I suppose the optimistic part of me thinks hopefully the technology will help fix it. What do you think? What do you think about the future of art?
Well, I'm reminded all the time about when the synthesizer came in for music, and you could actually make everything, every sound perfect. You could just take a woman's voice and then make her sing an aria like Joan Sutherland. And people were quite concerned about that. But when I remember, some people will remember Les Gock, who used to be the guitarist in Hush. And he was also a great jingle writer in advertising, so I knew quite well from there. And I was talking to him about it, this is a long time ago now. And he said, yes, we did that for a while because it was cheap. So if a client didn't have much money, we could make them a soundtrack for next to nothing. But he said, nobody liked them. They were really cold because they were absolutely perfect. And he said, no human musician is absolutely perfect. And so now they still do use the synthesizer sometimes for everything, but they dial in imperfection because it sounds more human, it sounds more warm. So, and we still have composers and we still have human music everywhere. And the synthesised music is either used by composers and musicians creatively, or it's for cheap jack shit. And so it seems to have found its place. But I love this idea that it's not the perfection of the great artist that is the thing that we connect with. It's the imperfection. It's the mistakes. And what worries me a little bit is, what if AI learns about mistakes? And how endearing they are.
Well, undoubtedly that will happen through machine learning, because they keep improving. And I don't know whether any of you have heard about this or read about this, but there's actually a book that's been written by ChatGPT entirely that's being published in the next couple of months. And it will be interesting to see whether it does have a sense of heart, humanity, and whether it does have those little flaws that make it seem more human.
Yes, and we forget that we love the flaws, the mistakes, the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities. That's where we connect. Here's another question. How do we address systemic bias in AI? Now, you've talked about women, you've talked about people of colour, you've talked about class divisions and, of course, first world, third world, etc. But she or he mentions especially for invisible disabilities like autism and ADHD.
This is a really fascinating area, and I did some more research on this today as well, because I've written a couple of chapters about AI and disability. I lived with a dynamic disability last year. I used to always poo-poo smart homes. Oh, those gimmicks, they're pointless. Why would I have a smart home? And then I was in bed or in a wheelchair all last year and barely could get out of bed to turn on and off the light before going to the toilet or the shower when I showered once a week. And I really wished I had have had an app that could turn the light on and off. So AI can do some incredible things for people with visible and invisible disabilities. In fact, there's some wonderful research happening around the world now diagnosing autism spectrum disorders and also ADHD much, much younger through patterns of language. And it's interesting that this research used Mandarin and English, and people who have these particular type of conditions, it was evident whether they spoke Mandarin or whether they spoke English, and so they put this into the algorithm, and machine learning developed a diagnostic tool which is absolutely terrific. With regards to the negative side of it though, it's similar to all of the other biases and the intersectional discrimination, that a little bit of it in real life, we all have this unconscious bias, becomes deeper through machine learning, and that's what really concerns me deeply.
So it ingrains itself. I always used to think that about advertising, that it was not, it didn't change things. What it did was reflected what was, but by doing that, it was deeply conservative because it ingrained it. So it was a very conservative thing, and it's sounding like AI in a similar way repeats the biases over and over, which literally digs them deeper and deeper into its psyche as well as ours.
And you've hit the nail on the head there, because the media both reflects and shapes society, so too technology. And when you add artificial intelligence into that, it shapes it at scale. And it's happening so quickly, we might not be able to rein it in.
Okay. This is quite a long but very interesting question. I'm not sure if this is relevant to the discussion. However, I'm concerned that there will be both fewer jobs available in the future. Well, we've already discussed that to some extent, so it is relevant, and that entry and requirements for humans to find meaningful... I like the way we've started calling ourselves humans. We're sort of being infected already. For humans to find meaningful work will be considerably higher, particularly given that entry-level positions that younger people could rely on are now easy fodder for AI to perform. How can we develop our children in such a way that they will be able to all find a meaningful existence while competing with and using AI? If most entry-level positions are filled by managers willing to cut corners, how will graduate engineers and school leavers find those easier or entry-level, I suppose, jobs to cut their teeth on as they find a path to step up to positions that AI cannot perform. And they finish by saying, while writing this question, I can see the bias in my question, where I relate my concerns to the loss of some manual work post-World War II to machines. But I think the point here is a really important one. How do people learn their job? They start in an entry-level position and they learn on the job. The greatest possible respect to universities, which are very important, they can't actually give you that experience of the place and the work and all that stuff. If AI is doing all the entry-level positions, how do people get that experience?
I understand people's deep concern about that, particularly for the next generation. Going into a society where we're teetering on the edge of recession as well, it's incredibly concerning. And there's no perfect answer to it. What I would say is that for as many jobs that are lost, there will be different types of entry-level jobs that are created, but they will require different skills, and this is where training plays a huge part. We talk about the next generation as being digital natives, but they're not necessarily skilled with artificial intelligence. Some of them know coding, predominantly the boys more than the girls, unfortunately. Some of them don't. So we need to impress on them in the teenage years and in high schools that even if they're not interested in computing or technology, that they need that skill set for whatever job they go into, because there'll be different entry-level kinds of jobs and they'll need to understand that. However, I sort of feel like I've been the doomsayer up here. I need to throw in something a little bit positive here. Towards the end of the book, I look at a potential utopia and a potential dystopia. And every single writer about Utopia about 100 years ago had a similar kind of vision. Most of it was based on a socialist government with a universal basic income. But a lot of it was wildly optimistic about how the robots will do the jobs that we don't want to do. The manual kind of labour that gives us the time to have more lifestyle. Now, I put this out there as a challenge because this is a really intelligent audience and it's a privilege to speak to you. But we need to regain our leisure time. As technology has advanced, we've filled the available time with more work. Working from home didn't mean we relaxed more, it meant we had 12-hour days tied to our computer. So certainly the tech giants and living in a time of late capitalism is creating this problem. But we also need to, in a utopia, give the robots the menial jobs we don't want and use that time for leisure.
I always remember being at school in the 70s and the teachers saying to us one day, oh, your generation, the only thing you're going to have to worry about is what to do with all your leisure time.
And it never happened.
No, we were the 24/7 gen. Here's another interesting question. Why do you call it artificial intelligence? It's only machine learning, with all the dangerous biases that machine learning will introduce if unfettered. I think this question is challenging the idea that there's anything intelligent about artificial intelligence.
It should not be called artificial intelligence at all. Thank you for the highly intelligent person who asked that question. I start the book with this anecdote about the founding fathers of AI, these fine 10 men who created the world we live in today, which of course is utter bullshit. This technology was not created nor conceived by 10 men in the 1950s at Dartmouth in the US. It was built on the backs of many centuries of women and people of colour. The only reason it was called artificial intelligence is because that's what the Rockefeller Foundation, who was funding the conference, thought sounded sexy. And it's been blamed for cruelling the entire industry ever since, for the simple fact that distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell from the ANU, who's probably Australia's greatest expert in this area, says that that whole conference was based on corporations and capitalism. There was never any discussion about ethics or how artificial intelligence could help broader society. There are wonderful things AI can do. You know, there's actually an app that can tell you whether you are going to get breast cancer in the next 5 years, even if you have no diagnosis. There are wonderful robots in New York City that can sit with people with dementia or Alzheimer's and tell them stories and ask them questions to help relieve a bit of pressure on the carers. But none of this was discussed at the Dartmouth conference. It was all about how we're going to make some more money for the Rand Corporation, IBM, and our other sponsors. So yes, let's call it what it is, machine rote learning. It is not artificial intelligence.
It's very interesting. Yes, I read somewhere that it's now developing programs where it can predict if you're going to have Alzheimer's. Again, by the way you use your language, which made me think I'm never going near it.
I'm with you, sister.
Yeah, I don't want to know. Why would you want to know that? Somebody else has asked, I've noticed misinformation on new Bing AI on the voice to Parliament. What can be done to correct misinformation on AI or Google? Now, we've talked about this earlier, but I think it's really interesting in the midst of this debate about the voice to Parliament, how very important, human dilemmas can get distorted via machine learning.
We've spoken about the vicious circle of machine learning. Google is trying something with Bard because they're having so many problems with misinformation that could be called a virtuous loop. They're getting some of their employees who are experts in particular areas like with the voice to look at what Bard's coming up with and then to correct it. And when they correct it, that goes back into the more recent database that is used to train Bard again because it's continuous learning effectively. Now, that sounds very good in theory, but what I've learnt about Google and Facebook and all the tech giants is they spend an awful lot of money on the sections of their business that make them money and not a lot on things like that. So I sort of envisage it's three people in a basement sort of furiously typing like the cat on that keyboard. The only thing that we can do is to try to usher in a golden era of critical thinking, to talk to people about, look, what you're searching there is not correct. You need to search it somewhere else and get a proper journalistic source. I mean, journalism, to my mind, proper journalism, investigative journalism has never been more important because of the proliferation of fake news. In the next couple of months, when you search for something on Google, it will be Bard that comes up with your answer 100% of the time. And at the moment, it is deeply flawed.
It's sad that you say investigative journalism is so important because it's never been less well funded. The media is moving, certainly mainstream media is moving away from investigative journalists. Some of it, I would suggest, is moving into straightforward propaganda. Others is just a lot of clickbait. So the very tool we need to be able to know whether this is a legitimate source or not is becoming debased.
That's why I'm deeply concerned about the future. I don't know if any of you read it today, but Europe's largest circulating newspaper, admittedly it's a tabloid, but it's a sign of things to come, is handing over almost all of its editorial roles to artificial intelligence, which is terrifying. Although, look, I do want to acknowledge our privilege sitting here and talking about this because a taxi driver said to me the other day, he said, what are you writing a book about? I said, artificial intelligence. He said, oh, yes. Oh, you're all concerned about it now because it's taking white-collar jobs. He said, when it took our jobs with Uber, nobody cared. And I thought that was kind of, that had a grain of truth in it, that it's been affecting manufacturing and transport for a very long time, predominantly blue-collar jobs, and now it's affecting the creative industries and the white-collar jobs, and we are very worried about it. But I would also posit that living at a time of crumbling democracies around the world where we're likely to see Trumpism on steroids, according to someone I interviewed about this book with the rise in AI, that, an independent media has never been more important and neither has investigative journalism.
Yeah. And, I hold out the hope that where there is demand, there will be supply, and that because if we demand it, there will... The investigative journalists, the authoritative source, may actually grow in importance because people feel the need to really carefully check things out. Let's hope so. I've one final pre-submitted question, and it's a very polite one. It begins this way. Hi, and many thanks for this. I've been concerned about it for a while. It seems the female slave robot phenomenon, we're back where we started with your son, has already taken off. A brief scan of YouTube appears to show this. Men seem determined to design a life of servitude for women, and the women are only worthy of that if they're young and sexually attractive. Great. This happens in their gaming, which you also talk about in your book quite extensively, or when they live it abusively in real life. So at this point, how do we stop the misogyny and sexism clearly embedded in the AI and robot field when, and this is a really, really powerful point, we haven't stopped it anywhere else?
Yes, how about a round of applause for that question? That really is at the heart of what my book is all about, how the bias of the past and the bias of the present are being built into the future. One of the women who I quote in the book, Dr. Joy Buolamwini, who's the head of the Algorithmic Justice League, they're like a band of superheroes, how good is that name? She has done some incredible work on this. She came up with an Aspire mirror where young black and brown girls in the US could look at it and have the face of Serena Williams reflected back to them. But she bought some software off the shelf and it did not recognise her face until she put a white mask on. She talks, writes and does a documentary called Coded Bias on Netflix and talks about the coded gaze as being the next step on from the male gaze. So this is all deeply, deeply interconnected. When you mentioned in that question about sex robots, yes, there are a few male ones. They are predominantly female in form. And there's a really problematic trend towards having a button on them where you can override consent. And they're deliberately designed to be raped. There's an organisation called the Responsible Robotics Foundation based in Europe, and a lot of wonderful academics around the world that are talking about this intersection because there will be so many more sex robots powered by AI and they will be very real. People will have relationships with them. Certainly they're bunches of metal and wires, but they represent the female form. And the research shows that if men rape them, and it's the same with child sex dolls, they are more likely to offend in real life. So in answer to the question, I really don't have an answer to the question. We do have to address the deep biases in society, otherwise they will continue to be embedded in these machines. And instead of going forward, Dr. Joy Buolamwini is convinced that we will go backwards to the 1950s and 60s at a rate of knots.
But surely it's quite interesting what I'm observing at the moment about, I've been a feminist for about 50 odd years, and I would have to say that women have changed beyond all recognition in that time. If I think about what women were like 50 years ago, what kind of lives they aspired to, what kind of hopes they had, what kind of opportunities they had, and what they just accepted as their lot and their limitations. And I now look at what women and their lives, it's miraculous, it's just extraordinary, it's wonderful. And we exist and we're highly educated. We're much better educated than men. Are we just going to quietly put up with it? Surely we've come this far. Yes, I know there's a hideous backlash, but as you and I were saying when we were sitting down there, in a weird way the backlash is a strange confirmation of how radical the change has been, because its very shrillness is indicative of how terrified patriarchy is. So is the hope that we won't go into the kind of dystopia that your professor was talking about, actual women and men of goodwill and decency refusing to allow that to happen?
Before I answer that, I want to acknowledge and thank you for all the tremendous work you've done in social justice and feminism, because a round of applause for Jane Caro. Thank you.
Tracey.
Because we stand on the shoulders of giants. What you said just then reminded me of that wonderful Martin Luther King Jr. quote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, that each generation takes it further. The way I'd like to answer this is to lean a little bit again on distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell, because I write this book as a journalist and a feminist, but not as an expert. And she has this wonderful quote that we do face a very frightening future, but we owe it to ourselves to tell hopeful stories. But at the same time, we must disrupt the present for those stories to take place. So yes, we do keep taking it further. Yes, we keep rattling the cage. And yes, we have to keep believing in humanity.
And can AI help us with climate change and some of the wicked problems that we currently face and that to some extent humanity seems to be flummoxed by?
AI can do two things with climate change. One is it has its own enormous climate footprint, which is problematic. It's currently being used to help oil and gas barons work out where to drill even deeper to get the so far undiscovered reserves. But at the same time, because it's based on complex mathematical models, it can help us in buildings and in more developed societies, show us the places where we can reduce our carbon footprint. There is great optimism at that intersection of artificial intelligence and climate change. But again, as civil society, we have to have our voices heard and say we want to use it for good, not for evil. On that point, there's one thing I'd love all of you to do if you have time before the 26th of July. The government has put out a public discussion paper on what you want as members of civil society when it comes to regulation, legislation around AI in this country. And so please hop onto the government website for industry and science. It's a really easy form to fill out because we need to have our voices heard in all of these areas.
Absolutely. So we're getting towards the end of our discussion, and you did mention before that towards the end of your book, last few chapters, you contrast dystopia and utopia. And I think whenever we look at the future, there is a tendency to look at it sometimes if you're in you've just read a really bad news story as a dystopia. And so reading your book occasionally when I was feeling particularly discouraged, not by your book, but by life or whatever else was going on, I would think of a planet which was absolutely ravaged by climate change, but there were all these appearing to be people on it, completely fine, because of course they weren't actually people at all. They were the robots and drones and things, and they didn't care what the climate was like. They don't need to breathe oxygen. So that was my dystopian vision when I was feeling miserable. But then there's the utopian vision of the future, which you were talking about before, where, you know, all the menial tasks and the stuff that really grinds people. I mean, sometimes I think we need to look back on the 40-year-old woman from a working class background in 1870 and how old, or even now look at some of the women who live in places like Sudan or Afghanistan, and you see their age and you think, holy, she looks 80. So poverty and unremitting labour grinds people down. So the utopia is that humanity can be freed from that. And also you were talking about it helping us in terms of people with disabilities. I did see an extraordinary piece of footage of an invention which was an exoskeleton for people who had been paralysed. And it was like a suit they could put on and walk around and behave as if they did not have paralysis, which is extraordinary. So are we going to have dystopia? Are we going to have utopia? Or in the normal human shitty way, something in between?
Look, since we are talking about utopia and dystopia, one thing that I researched that is controversial but is fascinating is the caring responsibilities that have predominantly fallen on women throughout history, and I'm reminded of what you were saying with, couple that with grinding poverty, and goodness me, it's a very difficult lot for a lot of women around the world. There are robotic uteruses now and robot child carers in Japan that are actually working in childcare centres. And while that might be too far for some, I, for one, love being a parent, love being a hands-on parent, but if that can relieve some of the burden from women, then that's fantastic, and that could create
Jesus, men will do anything, won't they, to get out of looking after their kids. They'd rather have a robot do it. For goodness sake, step up.
I do write about that in the book too, that I was very excited about this, and then I thought, well, hang on, maybe if men were more hands-on with the housework and the child rearing, that would fix it even better. And I felt the same way with the robots, with caring for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. Why don't we just pay people in caring professions more and value them and venerate them more? So I'd hate to see the robots coming in, and instead of us fixing some of these fundamental things in society just being a band-aid. I suspect you're right, that it will be a combination of utopia and dystopia, the kind of shitty mix that we've got at the moment. But my main call to action is we have to think about it and do something about it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I recommend Tracey's book to you? It is jam-packed with facts and research and the background and ideas about where it could go and what is good about it, what's bad about it, what we need to be aware of. I really thank you for doing all that hard work because I think you've just given me what might have been 10 years of learning in, a week, which is absolutely wonderful and not artificial at all. So I recommend it to you because it is something we are going to have to grapple with, and if we don't understand what the hell it is and what it can actually do, then we are really waiting to be victimised by it. So this is a book about taking back the power, I think. It's about taking back the power and making sure that ordinary human beings make sure that machines learn the right things and not the wrong things. And that's all our responsibilities, I suppose. Can you thank Tracey Spicer? Thank you.
And give it up for Jane Caro.